There were instances of local anti-gay initiatives, for example, the 1964 effort by conservative Catholics in New York to block sodomy law reform. But these instances were largely local, and it wasn't until that Save Our Children campaign that homosexuality politics, anti-gay homosexuality politics, took kind of religious base on a national level. Before that, before the late 1970s, the most visible face of religious politics around homosexuality were groups of clergy activists, Protestant clergy activists, who were influential in a number of ways. And the most well-known of these is the 1964 founding of the Council on Religion and the Homosexual, a group in San Francisco that influentially helped advocate for changes in police brutality and discrimination against queer populations in San Francisco. That same body of liberal Protestant clergy, Methodist, United Church of Christ, Presbyterian, and Lutheran, were also involved in denominational networks and had an influence in a number of church statements issued in the mid to late 1960s and into the early 1970s. And most of these declared Christian support for, most prominently, sodomy law reform, as well as a number of anti-discrimination policies. And the most progressive of these was the United Church of Christ statement issued in 1969 on homosexuals and the law that supported civil rights for homosexuals. In 1970, Presbyterian Church and Lutheran churches also issued similar statements, as did the United Methodist in 1972. There was a catch, however, to these statements, even as they offered in their context, very radical means of support for various political initiatives that would benefit homosexuals. In most of these documents, there were also statements that maintained the moral stigma of homosexuality. That is, it's one thing to be involved in public activism around sodomy law reform, around non-discrimination policies, but that should not be confused with denominational teachings that continue to maintain homosexuality as a sin. Now, this public-private or civil-religious divide is a pretty interesting one. Most of these statements of support for civil rights very clearly, of course, separated church teachings from public law. To borrow from one bishop's formulation, I quote, "Just because a thing is a sin doesn't mean there should be a law against it. These permissions to political support in the public square rested on a logic of religious disestablishment and public non-sectarianism. That is, churches were private places of personal religious practice. Public law should enforce the common good, not sectarian doctrine. The distinction between public and private, civil and religious, has enabled liberal Protestant activism around a number of gay rights issues, even as their own denominations have been embroiled in conflict over whether or not self-avowed practicing homosexuals, to use the term often used there, could serve an ordained leadership position. So even in some cases, as there are policies for civil non-discrimination policies, denominations maintain ways of exempting themselves from being able to hire gay and lesbian clergy to certain ordained position. So a variety of mainline Protestant churches have formally submitted amicus briefs on litigation over sodomy law, for example, even while there are ongoing debates over whether or not homosexuality is actually sinful. So that's some of the picture of the doubleness of liberal Protestant support for sodomy law and non-discrimination policies in particular. And it's because of this doubleness that I argue that the liberal Protestant and in some cases more broadly liberal religious support for these policies has not had the kind of visibility that conservative Christian argumentation has had in kind of public square and media coverage of these things. Because conservative Protestants are directly making arguments based on religious convictions, while the religious arguments of liberal Protestants are a bit more elliptical, let's say. Another reason for the relative lack of visibility to liberal Protestant and other liberal religious groups is that they're simply outnumbered. Mainline Protestants constitute now about 15% of American denomination or American religious practitioners. Evangelical Protestants, on the other hand, are about 25%, and conservative Catholics, are about 25%. So the numbers are, mainline denominations are relatively small and also declining. So, what I think is interesting now about the push for same-sex marriage is that it makes visible the religious support for this issue in ways that earlier issues, sodomy law reform and civil rights protection, have not. And that's one thing I think is different about same-sex marriage debates, and one thing that makes it distinct from these earlier and ongoing political issues. Marriage politics, I think, also illustrates how permeable is the imaginary division that ostensibly separates religion from government, church from state. Pro-same-sex marriage activism crosses boundaries in many ways between the civil and religious, and I would say just as much, even though not as visibly, as does the conservative religious opposition. And I think there are 2 points to consider here, given this larger history of very, very quick history. There's much more that could be said here about the overlap between religious politics and LGBT politics. I think this history suggests, first of all, the possibilities of alternative foundations for contemporary same-sex marriage advocacy. What would it look like if same-sex marriage politics were fought on the battlefield of pluralism rather than secularism? There are several ways of making this argument. I'll take the risk to make it in the most unabashed fashion. What same-sex marriage politics means, perhaps, is more religion, not less. More freedom for religion rather than freedom from it. And that would be to highlight the religious support for same-sex marriage advocates rather than basing the dominant argument on religious disestablishment and on the civil rights being distinct from religious rights. At the same time, and on the other hand, this history also suggests that politics based on secularism are perhaps impossible, practically. If there were to be a consistent politics of secularism, it would require, in the name of religious disestablishment, not only the disestablishment of one man, one woman marriage, but the disestablishment of marriage entirely. So that's perhaps another thing to take into consideration as we wrestle with this ambivalent inheritance of religious support for gay rights.